It was a quiet evening at Camp Tule Lake, California. In the summer of 1944, the sun dipped low behind the wooden barracks, casting long shadows across the dusty parade grounds. A few Japanese prisoners leaned against the fences, their faces etched with fatigue and suspicion. They had been captured weeks before, shipped across the Pacific, and placed in a land so alien that even the air felt strange. From the center of the camp came an unfamiliar sound, the low hum of a projector starting, followed by the faint tinkle of piano keys. A canvas screen was unfurled between two posts. The prisoners exchanged wary glances. Movie nights were not what they expected from captors they had been taught to fear. Then, the first notes of a live orchestra rose from a small stage beside the screen. Violins, a cello, and a trumpet carried across the grounds. Some prisoners laughed nervously. Others stared in disbelief. The idea that their captors, the Americans, would not only feed them and house them, but also entertain them was almost inconceivable. And yet, for the first time since capture, fear mingled with curiosity. A seed of something unfamiliar, hope, even, was quietly taking root. By 1944, the Pacific War had stretched across thousands of miles of ocean, leaving behind a trail of battles, islands, and shattered lives. Japanese soldiers who surrendered were seen as dishonorable under their own culture. Bushido, the warrior code, dictated that surrender was shameful, almost unforgivable. Families were taught that prisoners would be executed or suffer unimaginable hardship. Yet thousands fell into American hands after engagements like the Guadalcanal Campaign, the Battle of Saipan, and the Mariana Islands Campaign. The United States, in contrast, had codified principles for the treatment of prisoners under the Geneva Convention. Captured soldiers were entitled to humane treatment, medical care, and protection from violence. Across the mainland, isolated from the warfront, POW camps in California, Arkansas, and Kansas became temporary homes for Japanese soldiers. Administrators faced enormous challenges, maintaining security, preventing escape attempts, and providing for hundreds, sometimes thousands of men, many of whom arrived malnourished, hostile, and skeptical of their captors' intentions. Life in the camps followed strict routines. Roll calls, assigned work details, and guard oversight punctuated the days. Japanese prisoners, trained in a culture of discipline and obedience, initially adhered quietly to orders. Yet beneath the surface, tension simmered. Men feared for their lives, struggled with shame, and grappled with the unfamiliarity of surrender. They had expected brutality, yet what they encountered was discipline without cruelty. American officers recognized that the monotony and psychological strain of confinement could lead to unrest. They devised programs to maintain order and morale, drawing on recreation, education, and cultural activities. Small libraries, sports fields, and organized work assignments were introduced first. But beyond these practical measures, some camp commanders experimented with something radically different: entertainment for its own sake. Movie nights and musical performances were arranged, not merely to pacify the prisoners, but to provide a window into normalcy, a subtle, almost radical assertion of humanity in the midst of conflict. For the Japanese POWs, such gestures were incomprehensible. They had been conditioned to expect fear and punishment, not laughter or music. To see Americans setting up a projector, tuning instruments, and preparing an orchestra seemed to contradict everything they had been taught about the enemy. At first, suspicion dominated. Many watched from a distance, arms crossed, wary of hidden traps. And yet, as the first evening approached, a quiet tension built across the camp, a mix of dread, curiosity, and an unspoken anticipation. The stage was set for an encounter that would redefine their perception of captivity. The rules of engagement had shifted from the battlefield to the human mind. Here, victory would not be measured in bullets or bombs, but in trust, wonder, and the quiet miracle of shared humanity. By the time movie nights and orchestras were introduced, life inside the camps had already been shaped by weeks of routine and tension. Japanese POWs spent their days performing assigned labor, repairing fences, cleaning kitchens, tending gardens, or maintaining camp facilities. Guards monitored every step, ensuring compliance, but rarely resorted to physical punishment. Meals were consistent, though often unfamiliar, consisting of vegetables, meat, and grains prepared in ways that seemed alien to the prisoners' taste. The rhythm of the day was predictable, but for men trained to value honor and obedience, it felt both strange and humiliating. Recreational programs began as small experiments. Some camps organized sports matches, soccer, volleyball, and baseball, which allowed prisoners to move their bodies and release stress. Reading materials were made available, though censorship limited political content. Classes in English, geography, and practical skills were offered for those willing to participate. Even these modest initiatives met with skepticism. Japanese soldiers had been taught that cooperation with the enemy was dishonorable, and many remained silent observers, their pride warring with curiosity. The decision to introduce movie nights and orchestras emerged from a combination of practicality and vision. Camp administrators understood that bored, anxious prisoners were more likely to resist authority, escape, or fall into despair. Yet beyond practical concerns, some officers recognized a deeper opportunity to humanize the enemy and demonstrate that captivity did not mean cruelty. In this mindset, a simple projector and a borrowed piano could become instruments of psychological transformation. Movie reels arrived from nearby cities or military stockpiles, ranging from comedies and musicals to dramatic war films. Local orchestras or military bands volunteered their time, performing familiar Western compositions as well as contemporary pieces. Popular in the United States, initial Japanese reactions were mixed. Some prisoners sat in the back rows, arms folded, glaring at the glowing screen. Others whispered to one another, debating whether this display was a trap, a mockery, or perhaps a subtle form of manipulation. Yet the very presence of these activities challenged their expectations. They had anticipated harsh treatment, isolation, and suffering. Instead, they were being offered leisure, an unfamiliar concept that forced them to reconsider their assumptions about the Americans. Who held them? Historically, these entertainment programs left lasting impressions. Memoirs and oral histories from former POWs consistently highlight moments of disbelief and quiet wonder. Some noted the surreal contrast. Soldiers who had fought fiercely against the Americans now clapped politely at musical performances or laughed at comedies, experiencing a strange mixture of relief and confusion. The acts of kindness did not erase their memories of war, but they created a bridge, a human connection across lines of conflict. By the summer of 1944, the stage was set for an extraordinary cultural encounter. The prisoners' curiosity was piqued. Their skepticism remained, but it was tempered by the undeniable fact that the Americans were offering them moments of joy and normalcy without expectation or coercion. These evenings, filled with music and moving images, would soon become pivotal experiences, moments that illuminated the humanity of captors, challenged the prisoners' assumptions, and planted the seeds for a more profound understanding that would linger long after the war ended. The quiet anticipation of these first events naturally led into the human angles of the story, the personal experiences, cultural shock, and emotional reactions that defined the prisoners' lives in ways far beyond the physical confines of the camp. Human angle, shock, curiosity, and emotional conflict for many Japanese POWs. The first sight of the projector, an orchestra, was disorienting. Men who had been trained to expect the worst, beatings, starvation, humiliation, found themselves offered a chair, a drink, and a chance to watch a film. Some sat stiffly, hands clasped, eyes wary. Others whispered among themselves, questioning the authenticity of what they were seeing. Laughter from fellow prisoners felt almost dangerous, like a betrayal of the code they had lived by for years. Yet, beneath the initial disbelief, curiosity began to take root. Eyes followed the musicians' movements, noting their precision, their concentration, and their calm. The melodies, unfamiliar at first, gradually became soothing. Films portrayed stories of ordinary life, romance, and humor, concepts that many POWs had not encountered in months, sometimes years. Letters later written by prisoners described a strange mix of shame and wonder. Shame for enjoying something provided by the enemy, and wonder at the realization that Americans could be humane, disciplined, and compassionate at the same time. For some, the experience prompted reflection. A soldier might glance around, realizing that the guards themselves were not cruel, merely human beings performing their duty. The cognitive dissonance was profound. A man trained to see surrender as dishonorable now found his captors demonstrating generosity. Emotions that had been suppressed, nostalgia, longing, even hope, began to surface. Cultural contrast, Japanese expectations versus American practice. As Japan's military culture had instilled a rigid hierarchy, a reverence for authority, and a deep suspicion of the enemy. POWs had been taught that captivity was synonymous with suffering, and that survival demanded endurance and silence. Kindness, in their worldview, was often a ruse or a sign of weakness. The Americans, however, approached captivity differently. Camp administrators followed the Geneva Convention, not as an abstract law but as a practical framework. They believed that treating prisoners humanely reduced resistance, improved cooperation, and upheld the moral high ground. Recreational programs, from sports to films to orchestras, were part of this strategy. To the Japanese, these gestures were bewildering, yet they also revealed a worldview rooted in respect for human dignity. This cultural collision created tension and fascination. POWs observed behaviors that defied their expectations. Officers quietly conversing with prisoners, soldiers smiling while distributing food, and musicians performing not to mock, but to entertain. Slowly, some prisoners began to mirror these behaviors: timid smiles, polite applause, and even hesitant conversation, small but significant departures from the rigid norms they had internalized. Administrative, tactical angle. Why entertainment work at camp? Commanders understood that boredom and despair were more dangerous than escape attempts. Men confined for months without stimulation could become unruly, depressed, or passive-aggressive. Movie nights and musical performances were tactical decisions as much as cultural experiments. Mechanically, they served multiple purposes. They occupied prisoners' time, created predictable routine, and allowed administrators to monitor behavior in a controlled setting. Psychologically, they fostered compliance and reduced tension. Witnesses later recounted that after an evening of music or film, prisoners were more willing to participate in daily routines and more cooperative in work assignments. The tactical benefit extended beyond obedience. Camps that implemented recreational programs reported fewer incidents of sabotage, fewer attempts at escape, and a notable decrease in overt hostility toward guards. It was a silent, almost invisible victory. The Americans had transformed the prisoners' behavior not through force, but through engagement and humane treatment. Leadership angle: commanders who championed humanity bend the orchestras, and movie nights were officers who understood the power of empathy in warfare. Camp commanders such as Colonel Harry Smith Lake and Lieutenant Colonel Donald Watt recognized that humane treatment was not merely a moral choice, but a strategic one. They organized musical performances, sourced film reels, and coordinated volunteers from nearby towns. Their decisions required foresight and courage. Many contemporaries considered entertainment for POWs frivolous or even risky. These leaders had to balance security with humanity. Every event, whether a jazz concert, a piano recital, or a showing of the adventures of Robin Hood, was meticulously planned to prevent disorder. Guards were briefed, seating arrangements monitored, and emergency protocols established. Yet within these constraints, officers allowed freedom of expression. Musicians could improvise, and films were selected for enjoyment rather than propaganda. Leadership in these camps was not authoritarian in the traditional sense. It was disciplined, deliberate, and guided by a philosophy that respected the prisoner's dignity. Psychological angle: the impact of recreation on POWs. Recreational programs had profound effects on the mental state of prisoners. Japanese soldiers, conditioned to suppress vulnerability, began to experience moments of emotional release. Laughter, applause, and engagement with music or film challenged their expectations, creating cognitive dissonance. Initially, many felt guilt or shame for enjoying themselves. Yet gradually these activities reduced tension, alleviated stress, and improved morale. Psychologists studying war behavior note that boredom, uncertainty, and monotony in captivity can lead to depression, aggression, or apathy. The introduction of recreation countered these risks. POWs became more responsive, cooperative, and socially engaged. Daily routines were followed more willingly, and incidents of resistance decreased. Movie nights and orchestras, while seemingly minor, served as catalysts for mental stability, demonstrating the effectiveness of cultural and psychological interventions in a military context. Enemy perspective: Japanese POWs. Reflection seconds from Japanese POWs provide insight into their astonishment. In letters, memoirs, and oral histories, many describe their first experiences with organized entertainment as surreal. One soldier recalled, "We had expected punishment, yet they gave us laughter and music. I did not know how to respond." Others noted the moral complexity of enjoying something provided by the American. It challenged deeply ingrained notions of honor and obedience. Some prisoners initially resisted participation, fearing ridicule from fellow captives or dishonor. Yet repeated exposure to these activities softened attitudes. Conversations between prisoners began to include descriptions of films or music performances, bridging isolation and fostering a sense of community. Over time, POWs began to anticipate events rather than dread them, and the shared experiences created an unexpected bond, not with their captors, but with each other. Moral, cultural angle: the ethics of humane treatment. Implementation of entertainment program posed moral questions even for Americans. Why provide leisure to the enemy in the midst of a brutal war? Camp leaders framed it as adherence to the Geneva Convention, but it also reflected a belief in universal human dignity. The approach demonstrated that strength did not require cruelty, and that compassion could coexist with wartime necessity. For Japanese POWs, the gesture blurred lines between friend and foe. They began to see Americans not solely as enemies, but as humans capable of generosity. This cultural exposure planted seeds for post-war understanding and reconciliation. Scholars note that humane treatment in captivity often had long-term effects, influencing perceptions of the enemy and easing post-conflict tensions. In these camps, music and cinema became more than entertainment. They were instruments of moral influence, cultural exchange, and psychological transformation. The evening had arrived that would remain etched in the memories of every prisoner present. A hush fell across Camp Lake as the sun dipped below the horizon. The barracks cast long, stretching shadows, and the dusty grounds glimmered under the last streaks of daylight. Japanese POWs gathered cautiously near the canvas screen, murmuring among themselves, unsure what to expect. The very idea of entertainment in captivity felt contradictory, almost impossible. From the side of the field, the orchestra began tuning. Violins, a cello, and a lone trumpet sent tentative notes into the warm evening air. Some prisoners stiffened at the first sound. Others exchanged incredulous glances. This was not the war they had imagined, There were no bombs, no harsh commands, only music. Then, the projector flickered to life. Light spilled onto the canvas, illuminating scenes of laughter, drama, and adventure. The prisoners leaned forward, their eyes widening. Whispered comments began, soft at first, then slowly building into quiet laughter. Men who had sat rigidly, arms folded, now shifted, some smiling cautiously, others covering their mouths in disbelief. The orchestra's music swelled, accompanying the on-screen action. A soldier wrote later in his memoir, "The violin was a voice I had never known could exist outside my imagination. It spoke of peace, of normalcy, of life beyond war." In that moment, the boundaries between captor and captive blurred. The prisoners' focus shifted from fear to attention, from suspicion to wonder. Not all were ready to embrace the change. Some remained seated at the edges, wary of appearing weak, of enjoying something provided by the enemy. Tension surfaced briefly, a quiet dispute over seating, a whispered warning not to engage too eagerly. But these moments passed as the music and film drew others into shared experience. Stopped by the midpoint of the evening, a subtle transformation had occurred. POWs began clapping at musical interludes, commenting quietly on the films, and even exchanging smiles with guards stationed nearby. The human connection was fragile, but undeniable. What began as skepticism had evolved into tentative participation, a shared acknowledgement that in this space, even in the heart of war, humanity persisted. For the American staff, the scene was equally profound. Officers and musicians watched from behind the fences, noting the prisoners' reaction. Every shift in posture, every soft laugh was evidence of a psychological victory, one that required no force, only patience, foresight, and respect for human dignity. As the night deepened, the music and moving images continued, illuminating faces that had known only fear and defeat for weeks. The prisoners' disbelief began to waver, replaced by a quiet awe, a realization that captivity need not erase humanity. In this moment, music and film became more than entertainment, they became a bridge, a catalyst for emotional and cultural transformation. The first movie night, an orchestral performance, ended with polite applause. Many prisoners remained seated, unsure how to respond, while a few walked away whispering to friends, still absorbing the surreal experience. It was a turning point, a defining moment where fear and suspicion gave way to curiosity and the faintest stirrings of trust. And as the glow of the projector faded into darkness, the seeds of change had been planted, a transformation that would ripple through the camp in the days and weeks to come. The following evenings built upon that first night, each event growing in confidence and complexity. The orchestra expanded, adding more instruments, flutes, clarinets, and a full drum section. Movie selections became varied, comedies, musicals, even newsreels depicting life far from the war. Slowly, the prisoners' skepticism gave way to engagement. One evening, as the first notes of Beethoven's Ode to Joy rang out across the camp, a group of prisoners sat together in awe. Their faces, usually stoic and guarded, softened. Eyes glistened in the candlelight, and whispers of appreciation passed from one man to another. From men who had been trained to suppress emotion, this was revolutionary. They were experiencing something entirely foreign, beauty without cost, joy without danger. The reactions were not uniform. Some POWs remained seated apart, arms crossed, as if watching a strange ritual unfold. Yet even they could not deny the power of the moment. The orchestra's music seemed to fill the camp itself, washing over the fences, the guard towers, and the barracks. It was a reminder that life, culture, and human connection endured even amidst the confines of captivity. Film nights also evolved. American officers selected stories that depicted heroism, perseverance, and ordinary life, themes that resonated universally. Prisoners began to discuss plotlines quietly with neighbors, pointing out details or sharing laughter over comedic scenes. Guards, initially tense, now watched silently from behind fences, recognizing that the POWs were participating without incident. Trust, subtle but palpable, had begun to form between captors and captives. The psychological impact was evident. Prisoners became more cooperative in daily routines, completing labor tasks with less resistance and more efficiency. Tension among the men decreased, and small acts of camaraderie emerged. In letters and later memoirs, POWs recounted these nights as transformative moments when they realized that the enemy was capable of empathy and order, and that captivity could coexist with dignity. There were symbolic moments that captured the essence of this transformation. A young soldier, once silent and withdrawn, was persuaded to clap along with the music. An older officer, skeptical at first, allowed himself a rare smile during a comedic film. In subtle ways, the prisoners began reclaiming their humanity, not through rebellion, but through participation in shared cultural experience. From the American perspective, these events validated a philosophy of humane treatment. The goal had never been mere entertainment. It had been the cultivation of psychological stability, trust, and order. Yet the results exceeded expectations. By engaging the prisoners' minds and emotions, the Americans had created a space where fear and hostility receded, replaced by curiosity, reflection, and even fleeting enjoyment. As the final notes of the orchestra faded one night, and the last flickering images disappeared from the screen, a quiet stillness settled over the camp. Prisoners lingered, reluctant to leave the glow of the shared experience. Some exchanged small smiles with guards, tentative gestures of acknowledgement that transcended language and culture. This series of performances marked a turning point, not a battle in the conventional sense, but a victory of empathy over fear, of humanity over suspicion. The prisoners had witnessed a truth they had never imagined, that even in war, even in captivity, people could extend kindness, create joy, and foster connection. The ripple effects of this transformation carried forward into daily life in the camp. Routine tasks were performed with more cooperation, interactions were less tense, and the prisoners' psychological resilience strengthened. The seeds planted during those nights of music and film would continue to shape the camp's atmosphere, preparing the way for the profound aftermath of humane treatment. The weeks following the introduction of movie nights and orchestras brought profound changes to life at the camps. For Japanese POWs, the initial disbelief had gradually transformed into cautious acceptance. Laughter and applause became familiar sounds, breaking the monotony of daily labor and the tension that had filled the barracks. Men who had once sat in silence or with arms crossed now participated, however tentatively, in the shared experiences orchestrated by their captors. Daily routines were smoother. Guards observed fewer conflicts among prisoners and noticed an increase in cooperation. During assigned work, maintenance tasks, kitchen duties, and labor assignments were carried out more willingly, and minor infractions decreased significantly. The recreational programs were proving their practical purpose, fostering psychological stability and reinforcing order within the camp. The human impact, however, went beyond compliance. Prisoners began opening up in small ways, sharing observations about the films or discussing the music with fellow inmates. Some even expressed pride in mastering small aspects of the camp's cultural offering, such as following a musical rhythm or memorizing lines from English-language films. These activities introduced subtle but meaningful social cohesion among the men, reducing isolation and giving them a sense of purpose and engagement. Letters and memoirs from former POWs later described these evenings with a mixture of awe and incredulity. One soldier reflected, "I had never imagined that the enemy could give so freely without expectation. It was confusing, but it reminded me that life could still exist even in captivity." Another wrote that the orchestra made him realize the beauty of human endeavor, precision, discipline, and artistry existed outside the battlefield, a world beyond war. Camp administrators also noted the educational value of these activities. Films often introduced prisoners to American culture, language, and values, while orchestras exposed them to Western music traditions. This subtle cultural exchange fostered a broader understanding, breaking down some of the barriers of mistrust. It was a quiet, deliberate form of influence. The POWs were learning about the captors not through force or instruction, but through immersion and shared experience. At the same time, morale among prisoners rose in unexpected ways. Men who had been withdrawn, anxious, or hostile began to anticipate recreational events. They adjusted their schedules, prepared for attendance, and in some cases, even volunteered to assist in setup. The programs demonstrated that humane treatment could coexist with discipline, creating an environment in which respect and order thrived. For the Americans, the benefits were clear and measurable. Camps became easier to manage, tensions eased, and the risk of unrest decreased. Officers and guards could observe the POWs' reactions and adjust their approach, reinforcing positive behaviors and ensuring safety. The orchestras and movie nights, initially experimental, had become integral to the psychological and operational strategy of the camps. Yet beyond the practical, the true victory lay in the prisoners' internal transformation. Fear, suspicion, and rigid adherence to cultural shame gradually softened. Through music and film, Japanese POWs began to encounter empathy, humanity, and beauty, forces that could not be captured in military strategy but that shaped the human experience of captivity in profound ways. The stage was now set for the longer-term consequences, the aftermath, that would extend beyond the camp itself, influencing former POWs' reflections on the Americans who had treated them with unexpected dignity. The long-term effects of movie nights and orchestras were profound, extending well beyond the immediate confines of the POW camps. Japanese prisoners carried the memory of these experiences with them long after liberation, reflecting on the striking contrast between their expectations of captivity and the reality they encountered. Many wrote in memoirs and letters that these evenings challenged their deepest assumptions about the Americans, the enemy who had captured them, yet treated them with unexpected kindness and consideration. For some prisoners, the experiences catalyzed personal growth. Soldiers who had arrived rigid, mistrustful, and emotionally closed began to understand that cooperation and engagement could coexist with honor. They observed that Americans did not view leisure and enjoyment as signs of weakness, but as a way to maintain order, morale, and humanity. Over time, prisoners began participating more actively in camp life, offering small acts of assistance and displaying manners that had previously been suppressed. In essence, the recreational programs had become tools of both cultural education and psychological rehabilitation. The camps themselves benefited from these shifts. Administrators reported fewer incidents of defiance or unrest, smoother execution of daily routines, and more harmonious interactions between prisoners and guards. The recreational programs had proven their tactical value. They reduced stress, reinforced discipline, and fostered a sense of normalcy that contributed to safer, more stable camp operations. Officers came to view movie nights and orchestras not as mere entertainment, but as strategic instruments in the art of managing captivity. The psychological and cultural impact was equally significant. Memoirs from former POWs frequently highlight the emotional resonance of music and film. A soldier recalled, "The orchestra played as if nothing else existed in the world. For a few hours, we were neither prisoners nor soldiers, just men listening and watching, alive to beauty." Another reflected that seeing Americans engage in music and laughter taught me that humanity could exist even in war, even between enemies. These moments challenged ingrained beliefs and created an enduring respect for the captors. Discipline, morality, and civility. Historically, these experiences also contributed to post-war reconciliation. Former POWs often returned to Japan with stories of humane treatment, countering the dominant narrative of cruelty and harshness. The seeds of empathy sown in the camps influenced attitudes toward Americans in the post-war period, shaping dialogue, understanding, and eventual cooperation. What had begun as a tactical approach to manage prisoners had become a bridge between cultures, an unexpected testament to the power of kindness and shared humanity. The consequences extended beyond individual prisoners. These programs served as examples for future military conduct, demonstrating that humane treatment and engagement could achieve both ethical and practical objectives. The psychological benefits, improved cooperation, and cross-cultural understanding reinforced the notion that even in war, acts of humanity could have measurable, lasting impact. As the camps emptied and soldiers returned home, the echoes of movie nights and orchestras lingered. The memory of laughter, music, and shared moments of wonder endured, not as a story of victory in battle, but as a victory of empathy over fear, of understanding over prejudice. In these quiet evenings, the war's human dimension was revealed, a dimension that outlasted the bullets, the confinement, and the fear, leaving behind a legacy of resilience, reflection, and a profound reminder that even in captivity, the human spirit could endure. The stage is now set to close this story with a reflection on the broader significance of the events, the lessons they offer about empathy, humanity, and the quiet power of kindness in the midst of war. The story of Japanese POWs experiencing movie nights and orchestras in American camps is a quiet testament to the resilience of the human spirit. Amid the chaos and brutality of the Pacific War, these prisoners found moments of unexpected beauty, music, and laughter, experiences that transcended the barriers of language, culture, and enmity. It was a profound illustration that even in the midst of conflict, humanity could assert itself in ways both subtle and transformative for the prisoners. These evenings were more than entertainment. They were lessons in empathy, trust, and the possibility of kindness in a world defined by violence. Soldiers who had surrendered in shame, expecting punishment and suffering, discovered that captivity could coexist with dignity. The music of an orchestra, the flicker of a film on a canvas, became symbols of hope and connection, challenging deeply ingrained notions of honor, loyalty, and fear. For the Americans, the initiative demonstrated the power of humane leadership. Officers and guards showed that discipline did not require cruelty, and that careful, deliberate engagement could shape behavior, foster cooperation, and build moral authority. The success of these programs was not only practical, it made camps safer and more manageable, but also profoundly ethical, showing that compassion could be a strategic asset in wartime. The larger significance lies in the enduring human lesson. Even amidst war, structured kindness and cultural exchange can bridge seemingly insurmountable divides. Former POWs carried these memories home, reshaping post-war perceptions, influencing reconciliation, and proving that the smallest gestures, music, laughter, shared moments, can leave an imprint far greater than any weapon. When we reflect on these camps today, the image remains striking. Japanese soldier, once rigid and fearful, seated beneath the evening sky, listening to violins, watching films, and for the first time, glimpsing a humanity they had never expected from their captors. In these moments, the war did not vanish, but it was suspended, replaced by something enduring, the quiet, transformative power of empathy. The story of these movie nights and orchestras is a reminder that even in the darkest chapters of history, small acts of kindness can illuminate the human soul, leaving a legacy that outlasts conflict, fear, and time itself.